Hello, everyone. My name is Luba Vangelova. I am the founder of The Hub, which is an online homeschooling hub that offers different programs, primarily, but not exclusively for homeschoolers. And today I am talking with Blair Lee, and I will let her introduce herself and what her professional background is, as well as what she has been doing most recently.
Hello, my name is Blair Lee. I thank you so much for listening to this. I am the founder of a community organization called SCA Homeschoolers. We have an online conference and we have quarterly online conference. We have a quarterly magazine that is actually, I think the conference is how Luba became interested enough to invite me on to be a guest. I have the master's, I have bachelor's in chemistry and biology. I have a master's in chemistry as far as my professional. I have taught at community college. I have worked in the homeschool community, both as a curriculum developer of science and project-based learning units. I, over the last 5 years, what I've really spent a lot of time writing and speaking about are how people learn best. That is an area that absolutely fascinates me. And it is uh, something that when you homeschool, or even when you don't, if you don't homeschool, I think that is something that we should really be more focused on, how a learner is accessing and processing information. And so I think that's what we're mostly going to talk about today.
Indeed. Yes. So, as we were chatting before we started recording, you were talking about how you came to value the importance of what you call learning skills, what some people classify as non-academic skills. I mean, we're talking about generally the same things, but if you could uh, tell the listeners why you call them learning skills and how you came to appreciate them, that would be a great start.
So let me write down that I also want to. I've got two different points here. I came to really think about the differences in how people were learning as a chemistry professor in college. And I would notice that I would have students come to my office hours and say, I have never had to study hard for a class before. And then I would have other students who, and often these were, I'd talk to these kids, they were gifted, school had come really easily to them. And then I had other students who were also coming to my office hours. And those students, they understood that you have to, how hard you might have to work in a class like chemistry. And those students were putting in the time and energy and work. And I began to think, isn't this interesting? I've got this cohort, and it happened every semester where you have a cohort of gifted students that are really struggling. And the thing about chemistry, in those early chemistry classes, is that they're gateway courses. So these are kids who are very ambitious. They want to be vets. They want to be doctors. They want to be nurses. They want to go into professions that you can't be if you can't pass chemistry. And I started thinking, what was the difference? And what I became obvious to me is that the people who had had to work to achieve their goals all through high school and, and before were skilled learners. What had happened for them is that they had become skilled at the act of learning. And
Mm.
then I thought, what are these skills? And so it was before I came to homeschooling, this is decades ago that I was having this thinking. And I began to really focus on, as once I got into the homeschool community and I was able to talk to other parents and through See Homeschoolers really look, one of the things that became clear is that there's like three learning skills and and that we'll talk about today: executive functioning skills, multimodal learner, and metacognition. And the reason that I don't think that of these as non-academic skills is that because what I observed in chemistry is they are foundational. Being the stronger you are in these learning skills, the better you are going to the the more likely it is, not better, but the more likely it is that when you get to something that's a gateway class that really keeps a lot of people out of medical professions, which is chemistry, that students that just understand how you learn, they know how to tap into themselves to put to where they're going to need to put one foot in front of the other. The more skilled those students are, the better they are at accessing and processing this information when it gets challenging.
Mhm.
And so I don't think that that it's not classic academics, but I think they're academics. I
Mhm.
think they should be woven into all academic study
Mhm.
work we do with our kids.
Right. And so you classified them into three categories. And can you also touch on, aside from being useful in classes such as chemistry at the college level, would you say that these are skills that are just important to have in life in general, no matter your path, your chosen path in life?
So we talk all the time about raising kids who are lifelong learners who love learning. I actually think that a natural segue from there is what skills are needed. What are the skills that you need to be a
Mhm.
lifelong learner? What are the skills you need to be able to love learning in a way that if you want to learn something, you know what to do to learn it?
Mhm.
I'm I'm going to say, sure, you might say reading. Okay, that's an academic skill. But there's a lot of things that we take as traditional academics that you wouldn't go there. So what are the skills? I think that we should really be having a conversation, and we are, but that as a cohort of people who are invested in our children's education, we should be having a conversation about what skills are needed for someone to be able to learn at any point, anything at any point in their life.
Mhm.
And that is where these skills come in.
Okay. And is there anything different in how an adult, once the children grow up, how they would learn things as adults? Like, are these skills basically skills that will carry them through their whole lives, or do they need to kind of learn different skills as they grow at different stages of their lives?
I think that these are skills that will stay with you. And actually, so for example, we haven't really defined these. Is a better question because I would love to go to the example of multimodal learning. And so I am in my 60s and my hearing is starting to go. But I'm actually a very strong balanced learner. This is when I say multimodal learning, I mean that you've worked with your learner so that they are strong in as assuming there's no learning challenges, that they are strong in the four primary learning modalities: reading, writing, kinesthetic, visual, and auditory. And the reason that you want to help your learner be strong in all four of those is so that they can access and process information no matter how it's given to them, no matter what assignment they get at work, no matter what a teacher asks you to do in a class, that you're able to bring out, if you treat these as tools, you're able to bring out the tools that are going to help you work on that most effectively. And so my hearing, I have about 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with tinnitus, which means I hear sound in my head 24/7.
Yeah.
Um, Luckily for me, it's crickets. For some people, it's things like train horns. And at the same time, my hearing was starting to decline. Just the so all of a sudden my auditory hearing learning, it's not as good because I just really struggle to hear. And so because I'm strong in these other three modalities, because was always a strong balanced learner, just naturally I have these others to be there to support me when I'm expected to learn using auditory learning. And so so for adults, it can change how you use them, but but once you have these, you have them,
Mhm.
right?
Okay.
Once you have the executive functioning skills of time management, things will change and it becomes more important as you get older. You have a job, those, your salary is
Yeah.
affected by whether you have good time management skills or how long you stay at a job. But I don't, I, I don't think that's a skill that changes once you
Mhm.
have it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so let's drill down on the skills. So you mentioned three different categories. Can you drill down and explain what falls within each category? You mentioned the modalities. So we've talked a little bit about that, but how about the other two categories?
Metacognition.
Mhm.
Metacognition is a really important skill, and it is knowing what you know is part of it. A lot of people stop there when they define metacognition, but to
Mhm.
know what you know is important, but it's where metacognition is really something that we should be working on is knowing what you know and being able to retrieve it and apply it to the learning that that you're involved in at the time. And so I really think of this as unpacking that information. We have facts in our head. What are you going to do? And in the right situation, how do you then unpack it and apply it? And
Mhm.
you do that, and it's important for building on knowledge. So if you are strong at being able to retrieve information, it's much easier for you to figure out where you need to build.
Mhm.
Right. So, for example, let's go back to the chemistry example. Students that were able to unpack science learning from high school because they were strong in metacognition had less to learn in chemistry. So it was more manageable for them.
Mm.
And students that are strong in metacognition are better able to make connections across disciplines.
Mm.
And that is actually really, really important as the world becomes more online and as there's more information available. I actually see it all the time how important it is to begin being able to connect skills. Let's say someone understands how global warming and climate change, for example. Well, if you understand those and somebody starts to talk about how how some marginalized communities are affected more, you can then bring in what you know about that science and see how that's going to have a bigger effect on people who don't have the resources to move or who don't
Mhm.
have good flood insurance and those sorts of things. And so you're able to take what you know in science and help it to have a more robust understanding of what's happening to people in historically or in a civic situation.
And I'll just interject really quickly on that point because I write a careers column for Science Teacher magazine. I've written it for 10 years. And a number of the people I've interviewed who work in science and engineering have pointed out exactly what you said, how important and valuable it is to be able to make those connections and be a cross-disciplinary thinker, not be, in that box. And that those people who can do that are in such great demand.
So that's really what I'm talking about with this skill, and it's not we don't work on it. We actually aren't super duper about really intentionally working on it, but it's not actually really challenging. There's some easy strategies to use, but
Yeah.
let's finish the
Yes.
definition of these.
Yes. And so that's covered two of the categories, and then executive functioning.
Executive functioning skills. Look, if you're listening to this and you're a parent, or maybe you're not yet a parent and you think you could use some work on these, we're all used to thinking of these in terms of our personal life.
Mm.
Executive functioning skills and teach in traditional schools. I've got grandkids I've got grandkids in school from TK to fifth grade. Um, and some of the teachers are it's really interesting to see what the teachers in second, third, fourth and fifth grade are working on. And one of my grandkids is in the second grader has a teacher who's really working on the executive functioning skills of time management and planning. And I can see that by the organization that that the teacher's expecting. The other three students, two of whom went to the same school, didn't have the same teachers and they weren't working on these same skills. And so it's just really interesting to me to see how some of these, so sometimes you'll get a public school teacher that will want to be working on these executive functioning skills. A lot of times in the homeschool community, or if you are in traditional school and your teacher's not working on it, I really think that there are some important um really important executive functioning skills that people should be thinking about working: persistence, organization, task initiation, planning, and being mentally flexible. Those are executive functioning skills that lend themselves to being worked on in the context of academics. And if these are things that you're working on with kids, let's say you've got two siblings and they drive each other nuts, so some of the executive functioning skills you want to work on have to do with the way they respond when they get frustrated. Academics is a great place to begin scaffolding those skills in a way that doesn't create as much friction as when you're waiting for the siblings to explode and then you have to work on them. It's way easier for you two to stay calm as you work on those skills if you're not in the middle of a situation playing mediator.
Okay. All right. Um, and so you mentioned a few executive functioning skills.
Mhm.
What would be the complete list of skills that fall into that category, or at least the most important, like, that you consider the most important?
I the most important now, okay, the most important executive functioning skills, I cannot define for an individual.
Mhm.
You need to define that for yourself. I believe that so my philosophy from the homeschooling is that kids receive a handcrafted education, even if you did not set out to handcraft your child's education. And what that means is that you tailor an education that is, because of how homeschooling works, where you are working one on one with your child, or even in a small co op in the homeschool community where you're working with a limited number of groups, you are more likely, because of the size, your student population size, you're much more likely to be paying attention to individual needs. And so I hesitate to give a top three list,
Okay.
because I could say, let's say I said flexibility, and someone's like, that's the biggest problem for me. But for a child who wants the one right way, flexibility might be the most important thing you're working on. And so it's
Mhm.
really, and it depends on what skills somebody already has. My recommendation is, honestly, is that if this is something that you want more information about with executive functioning skills, think about the executive functioning skills the top two executive functioning skills that would most benefit your child at this time. Let's say, and one of the things with executive functioning skills that you have to be careful of is executive functioning skills needed can be very individual. It can be based on the age and where you're at in your life. And so I'll see a lot of parents who don't need a lot of organization. They're like, I work best with controlled chaos. And they'll have a learner who is really struggling. And it turns out that their learner works best with a high degree of organization. It's actually, a lot of kids do best when when learning is kind of organized, because it helps them in their brain, figure out what they should be doing at any one time. And so that's something for you to really think about. If this is something that you're not even sure where to get started, I'm going to recommend the resource Smart But Scattered. It is not just for people who have ADHD. It's a wonderful resource, and they go into a lot of detail about the executive about just how you can work on specific executive functioning skills. How you do that in terms of academics and education. For academics and education, I would say the executive functioning skills that are most important: persistence. Just keep working on it. That's one of the skills that these chemistry students, the gifted students, didn't have a lot of persistence because they never had to. It's the thing that students that always had to work hard knew. "Oh, I just need to work a little harder on this so that I can get the concept." That is a really important skill in academics. Organization. Most kids don't work super well with controlled chaos, but then some do. Task initiation, it can't for there's posts that I see on social media all the time from parents who their kids just won't self-start. Planning. It depends if you want to be in charge of the planning as you start to scaffold older students, that might be important. And mental flexibility. Uh, Metacognition, by the way, I should point out, is sometimes considered to be an executive functioning skill. I like to take it out of executive functioning skills because it is so important to our ability to process what we already know at the time that we need it.
Yeah.
And there's the other thing that I didn't include in that list is frustration, and I really tie that into persistence. I think if you've got a child that gets frustrated easily, I think I would pair that with persistence, because they really work well together. Now, if you have just written down more than two or three executive functioning skills, I am going to recommend that you only work on two or three skills. I I don't know. A lot of times we will expect someone to be working on too many skills at the same time, and it just becomes a muddy mess. Pick those that you think are really uh, scaffold to the next level. Like, for example, um, organization probably is needed. If you have a child that doesn't organize well and they don't plan well, you probably want to be working on organization before planning.
Mm,
You know,
mhm, mhm. And so some questions have come to mind as you've been speaking. One being, well, first off, how can parents help their children develop these skills? So we've talked about the skills and how, so let's say they've picked the top two or three. How can they best help their children? And also, tangential to that, how can they help them if, as in an example you mentioned, they themselves don't have those as strong points?
so first of my number one tip is to model these skills for your learner. And in some ways, if you are not strong in the skill, if you're like, "I'm not well organized and my child's not well organized and I can see that it is affecting their academics," um, say to your child, "Boy, do I need to work on this. We need to work on the skill of organization." Model it. Talk to your learner about how you're learning to become better organized. How, let's say something you don't organize dinner well and you find out you don't have an important ingredient. Oh my goodness. Well, we're not having that for dinner tonight, or it's going to be a kind of different recipe because I didn't organize well when I made the shopping list. Like, actually talk about how your failure to organize affected something, and then have them help you be better organized. Like, do this together. And then because the number one way you're going to teach these skills is you're going to scaffold them in a learning situation. And so if let's just stick with organization. Let's say you're doing science that's got hands-on lab, which I hope if you're doing learning, I hope your child is learning science and the labs are hands-on, just to get on a soapbox for a brief minute. And then, so have your child organize the supplies. Here's the list. I'm going to let you organize the lab, scaffold them, talk to them about. So the first thing I do when I need to get supplies ready is I read over the list. Then I go and get everything I need. I do this 2 days before the lab, or the weekend before you're going to do the lab, because if there's anything that's not on the list, I want to put it on. I want to make sure that we get it before Tuesday when we're going to do science. Have this full on conversation, and that's when you hear educators talk about scaffolding. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about giving the support and the nurturing, and then do that for a couple of times, or until you see that they don't really need you, or until you think they don't really need you. Then step back.
Mhm.
Hey, so now how, yeah, you've done pretty good with you and I collaborating on this. What do we need to do this week? Step back. Hey, so Sunday, say, hey, did you do we have everything you need for science this week? That is you thoughtfully reminding them that they need to make sure and look over the list. Oh, good. Okay. And then if, for example, they say yes and there's something not on the that you can't do, say, rats, well, let's talk about how you can be better organized next time.
Mhm.
And then continue, and then you realize you stepped back too far. You need to be there, and they still need a little more of your support. And
Mhm.
so your goal is going to be that over a period of time, and when I say time, for some kids it might take 4 weeks, and other kids it's going to take 36 weeks. You're going to get to the end of the year and say, you did it. You're so well organized. You can totally be responsible for for getting all the labs set up.
Mhm.
And so you continue to incorporate that. Now, if your child is struggling with organization, you might just keep the organization around one class that does require a certain amount of hands-on lab class that requires organization. And if they start to be very skilled, have them help you organize for, give them a meal once a week that they have to organize, and so just keep working on it in that way, and that is how you scaffold for that skill. By the way, cooking is a highly academic. As a scientist, as a chemist, I can tell you that anytime anybody's in the kitchen making things, that is very scientific. There's a
Definitely. And are there situations where the child might kind of push back and feel like they're being kind of micromanaged or nagged, or they don't want the oversight, or resistance? If you get resistance.
Well, there's two things. If you get resistance, one of the things might be that they're ready for you to be less involved in
Mm,
their organization. Number
mhm,
one. If they get resistance and you can see that they still need input from you, it's time to sit down and have a conversation. One of the things that you have to realize when you are home educating your child, is that you can have big conversations with them about their learning. They don't always agree. I will tell you this, they will, if you are consistent and you stick with it, one day you will have an adult child who thinks that who understands the learning process, why you made certain choices. And my son came back to me and thanked me and said I was right.
mhm.
um,
um,
but the other reason that you'll get resistance that do want to say before you
sure, go ahead.
is that sometimes they're not ready, or they need
Mm,
more support. You need to be very careful. let's say you have a child who has fine motor skills issues that, and I mean, kids, especially if they're young or if you pulled them out of traditional school, a lot of times kids in they're too young to know what they don't that they are struggling, or you've got kids that mask. It's, when you're in a traditional
Mhm.
school, it's not cool not to be sort of in that normative section, and you will find masking. And so sometimes you won't realize that your child is struggling with something until, and all of a sudden you're asking somebody to be organized who has ADHD and it was been undiagnosed, or they have fine motor skills issues that aren't so big that you picked up on them, and all of a sudden you're realizing this is really a struggle for this person to organize. And so you're going to want to pay attention to that. You'd never want to ask someone they need more scaffolding. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be working on it, but it means you need to be doing a lot more scaffolding. And in some cases, you need to go back and look at the skills that might be precursors to whatever you're asking them to work on.
Okay. All right.
This is
Um,
all in what I like to call getting to know your learner. I actually have a phrase, I call it, "Who is this learner of mine?"
mhm. Um, yes, and I think that I've watched one of your videos, and I know that is a whole separate talk. You know, to really
Yeah,
get into the meat of that
yeah,
would, I think, be a separate talk. Although,
I agree.
absolutely, it's vital to know who you're dealing with first. Even as a
Mhm,
parent, there are some things that you may just not consciously think about, or
mhm.
just not know what to look for or be aware of, and the importance of this or that. But anyway, let's see. So we've talked about organizing a skill, and you gave some examples. Could you just give some concrete examples also of one other skill, just so we can see how a parent might scaffold a different skill?
I'm gonna go to balanced learning because I think that, so if you
Okay.
were in teacher education, if you're a teacher, if you've ever had any, you know that one of the things that you would learn is multimodal learning. So you can reach most kids, and I auditory and visual, and these are skills like auditory learning, visual learning. I'm looking at those as skills. So let's say you have a strong reading, writing learner who is not strong in kinesthetic learning, for example. I recommend that you incorporate that you so I recommend that those subjects that are challenging for your student, that you actually make sure have a strong foundation in reading, writing, learning, that they have that to support your learner. But then for the subjects that they find less challenging, I recommend that people incorporate, in this particular example, kinesthetic learning into that, so that and tell your learner, say, well, we're going to include some hands-on learning in this. That there you might get some pushback after you start doing that, because they start to struggle in something that was a strong subject, and then say, well, I want to work on kinesthetic learning for you, because you will encounter some situations where you want to be able to do hands-on learning, and I want to make sure that in those situations you are able to use that as a tool if it's the best way to learn something. And there, if you get pushback on that, I suggest do something that isn't one of the core academic subjects that you're working on, but continue to work on kinesthetics. Do something really fun that requires a hands-on manipulation of academic topics.
Mhm. Okay. All right. And um, so you mentioned in the talk that I heard you give um, the importance of giving praise and feedback. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how much and what type of praise and feedback? I mean, do you recommend basing it on effort or on outcomes or both? Or how do you go about deciding that? I imagine it's a bit of an art rather than a science, of course.
Number one, make it genuine. Do not give over. A lot of times you see generic praise. Give your, and you can think of this as if I were to praise you on something very specific to our interaction, for
Mhm,
example, you would know. You would think, I did a really good job with that, because you would know that that's a part of what, our interaction involved. So make sure that the praise is very genuine, and that it is targeted for the individual.
mhm,
That means that if you are working, let's say you're working in a co-op, and I have taught online classes, I would make notes as learners are interacting with me. I make notes so that there's something very specific that I can feedback that I can give them. And I like to think of it not as praise, but as feedback. I
mhm,
think of evaluations as what we need to think about with that kind of evaluation or that kind of feedback. It should nurture for growth. The other thing that I like to, I can't even remember where I read this, but it said that something that's important to say to kids is not, I'm proud of you. That is important to say. But what's really important that you include in that is, you should be proud of yourself for. Wow, I'll bet you're really proud of yourself for you. When we as educators give our children feedback, we are giving them language. And this is where I talk about in my talks. This is the language that you are giving your child that helps them understand. Even if they push back, or some kids aren't super comfortable with that kind of praise, you're giving really important that you pay attention. If somebody's working on, whether it's academics or one of these skills that I'm talking about, that you pay attention to the where they started, and you look at where they go next. And this is where it can be a little more challenging in a group situation. And so you will have, when I was teaching, I taught science classes to all grades, but the grades where this is more challenging is when you have a first grader in a class that you have a fourth grader in. The level of science for those two is just naturally way different. You can find things to praise the first grader and the fourth grader, and they shouldn't be being evaluated from the same level. You evaluate the first grader from where they're at, their age and stage, and you evaluate the fourth grader based on their age and stage. I feel that in a learner-centered education, in a world where we value the learner, that we make our praise and feedback very specific to the learner and the progress that the learner's made. I think it's incredibly unfair that we always talk about grade level, and that's what you need to, if you're below grade level, that's what you need to reach for. And that some students, and it doesn't just happen in grade school, it happens in college too, some students will make extraordinary progress, but they still don't get an A.
mhm, mhm,
I think that we need to, and it's because in that situation, in a gateway class, you sort of are stuck, because it's, if somebody makes an A in your chemistry class, they should be more likely to pass the MCAT, the test they need to take to become a doctorate. So that's a little more challenging. But in a home situation, you should always be evaluating the learner from where they're at. And if you've got someone that is struggling, you don't want to compare them to somebody who's not struggling, and you want to help them have the language where they begin to value their own personal progress.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
And it's challenging. We compare ourselves to other people.
mhm. Um, so I was going to ask, if you could define the purpose of the feedback. So it's to encourage further growth?
It's to encourage further growth. It's to the so there's um every educator should have a growth mindset when they are working with kids. Absolutely,
Mhm,
positively growth mindset. Our
mhm,
education system doesn't always lend itself to a growth mindset, but I'm assuming I'm talking to people who are largely outside of the traditional. And you have teachers, you have marvelous teachers who use a growth
mhm.
mindset with their kids.
Yeah.
So all evaluation should nurture for growth. It should always give kids a path for, what's next. And by that, I don't mean you did great in this. Now I want you to be working on that. No, 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 no. Don't do that. The other thing that evaluation should do is it should give people the language for themselves,
Mhm,
right? So, um, wow, when like if somebody writes something, this word choice is really interesting. I love the way you think in this context. There should be um now some always look for something positive, and because I believe that you should only be working on a limited number of things at the same time, those essays that have red marks all over them, what's the purpose of those? what and that's where I'm talking about. And so let's get into a specific example to help with
mhm,
defining that. So if you've got someone who needs to work on 2 or 3 skills,
mhm,
your evaluation reflects those 2 or 3 skills. It doesn't work. It doesn't show. Is there 10 things that let's say there's 10 more things that they need to be working on. Nobody can work on 12 different things at the same time and put it all together. Come on, that's just
mhm,
not even reasonable, and it's not realistic. And so that's the thing about evaluations. Have a kid work on 2 to 3 things. Now, one of the things that I did that I am a big fan of a mastery approach with evaluations. If
mhm,
you are being taught by me and I give you an evaluation, you are going to get that back. I'm not going to tell you what the answers are. You're going to get it back. And the way I like to tell people is no one learns everything the first right away. I'm going to give you back this, and so that you have the opportunity to look at where you need to spend more time with the information.
mhm,
And if you do that, now I was teaching high school students when I was doing this. If you do that and you turn it back into me, I value someone who takes the time to make sure that they learn something that where they didn't fully understand. You get full credit for that. I put learners in charge in a class where I had to give grades because they needed on their transcript. I put the learners in my class in charge of the grade they got.
mhm, mhm,
And I truly believe that that is how, if you value learning for the act of learning, that is how all evaluation should be. Everyone should be given the opportunity to go back and work on it. And that is very powerful when you go back and work on, let's say you've got somebody working on 3 different skills, and you give them the, within the context of that, what they're working on, to go back and correct those.
mhm,
And boy, should there be a lot of praise when that happens, because 2 things happen there. Sure, they turn back in something that is, I'm going to use the word correct, but you are just, so you have someone that I mean has the um, persistence and the fortitude to go back and cares enough about their own learning. That's mastering the act of your own learning, and that is powerful.
Mm, mhm. So, in a sense, it requires parents or professional educators, whoever it be, to look at things perhaps through a different lens than the lens that perhaps was used on them when they were growing up and learning things. To look at it based on giving feedback with the objective of nurturing growth. So therefore, being berated or criticized may not fulfill that objective. And also just looking at the journey and the process as much as, what the outcome was.
Oh,
Eh,
I totally take a I take a journey centered approach to learning. And if you're honest, I mean, let's be honest, think of anything that as an adult, everyone listening, think of one thing that you have, even if it was something that you already did before becoming an adult, but that you've really worked on, whether it's a hobby or you are more skilled just because it's a journey. You worked on it.
mhm,
You continued to work on it, and that sort of journey focus isn't I don't think that it sounds like sure, but the fact that we don't bring that to most academic settings, it's like you're done. It's like I call it a ticket mentality.
mhm,
What's the purpose of high school if your kid's going to college? It's ticket to college. Why
mhm,
do you need to learn this? You can't get into college without that.
mhm,
And I'm like chemistry. You can't become a doctor if you don't know chemistry. Okay.
mhm, mhm,
But it gets away from the actually profound amount of chemistry that we all need
mhm,
in our day-to-day life as we uh decisions that the better educated we are conceptually around that. So and so a journey focus really focuses more on the process, and it actually focuses more on the importance of the acquisition of knowledge
mhm,
for the knowledge. And right now, in at a time when we are dealing with really it seems to be people struggling with critical thinking skills and a world with a lot of conspiracy theories, I would argue that just learning things so that you can understand what's going on is important.
And one other thing. So we're all human, and if parents find themselves just really being, I guess one could say, triggered by the progress, or not necessarily lack, but it being acquired at a slower speed than what they would prefer, let's just put it that way. Um, if they find themselves just getting frustrated, what would you recommend in those situations? Do you have tips for that? Because I'm sure it comes up for many parents from time to time that there are certain things, maybe, I don't know if, maybe it happens more when a parent is particularly skilled in one learning skill and their child is not, and maybe they just can't understand why they're not getting it, or I don't know if that's often the triggering kind of scenario, or if it's more typical in different cases where the parent is also struggling in something. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, number one, I have never heard anyone refer to that as triggered, and I love it. I was like, oh my goodness, it's perfect. So I'll tell you that I'm really good in math. My son didn't love it. He's a good math student when he works at it. And we almost every battle we ever had was about math. He actually didn't want to learn math, and I was like, yes, you're learning math. That's important. So what do you do when you feel tricked? So the reason I told you that is because everyone don't think that I was never frustrated or triggered. It's happened. What you do is first of all, you need to, number one, you need to evaluate and make sure that your child is not, that there's not a neurological reason that they are struggling. That is very important, number one. Number two, you need to be thoughtful about the materials. This is where getting to know your learner can be really important. Are the materials that you're using a good fit? Did you, someone that works for me was actually helping run a talk that I was giving, a webinar that I was giving, and I started talking about learning skills, and they thought, I wonder, I don't think my child is a reading writing learner because they were late to read. And they then evaluated how their child learned and realized that the reason that their child was struggling with some of the materials was that they were a reading writing learner, and even though they weren't even though they didn't have those skills yet, because reading writing learners can sometimes be a little late on some of their learning because they have to get the reading skills before they can do
Mm,
and so be really thoughtful if you have a child that's affecting. The other thing that I recommend, so let's say neither of those are the issue. You're going to want to save work samples. Your the brain is complex and it's complicated. Make sure that you are saving work samples, and that is what you're basing your evaluation on. Now, a lot of parents get nervous if they have a child that is not performing at grade level. And that's academics. This happens to all the time because we have these academic ideas in our head for how our child's journey through learning. And I sometimes think that's because we're adults and we don't remember what it was like to be 8.
mhm. That's a
But
good point.
but you want to, if your child is progressing, that might just be the rate. There, a lot of times when kids are growing, the brain is putting energy into if your child's starting to go through puberty, if your child is in a growth phase, your brain can only do so many things. You'll see online where people will say, they had these skills and now they don't have them anymore. And, they're dealing with an 11-year-old who's grown if you were to find out they grew 3 inches last year and they're starting to go through puberty, brain's just putting the resources somewhere else. And so that can be part of it.
Hmm.
But let's say, what do you do when you start to feel frustrated? You need to take a deep breath and be reflective and figure out where your frustration's coming from, where your triggers are coming from. When I would become really the most frustrated, I would, it didn't happen often, but there were occasional times where I would just get really frustrated working with my child. And I would say, gee, we're not going to work on this anymore today. We'll get back to it. One of the things you have to realize is you've got to be careful that you don't allow your frustrations to create a situation that makes learning harder.
Mm,
And then I would say, if you're really worried, you might want to try outsourcing whatever you're really worried about,
mhm,
because you are the number one, you're the facilitating, if you're homeschooling, you're facilitating your child's education. If you're not homeschooling, you're still the person that your child pays attention to you. And if you're really worried about something, they feel that they have something to be really worried about. And so that's something you've got to be thoughtful about. Uh, that was, I took my own advice, by the way, and I outsourced math. I was like, you know
yeah,
what? I'm going to find somebody to teach you math. Now, this was before there was an out school and before
right,
that was an easy option. But
right.
I did find someone to teach math because we, I, I needed someone else to be in charge of helping facilitate that academic area. It was becoming a flashpoint. It was, math's the first period of the day, and then everything else is downhill from
Mhm,
there.
mhm.
Is there anything you can think of that I touched on so many
Yeah.
things right
And
there?
what about, so you mentioned, like, getting triggered by something that was an academic skill, but what about, like, let's say the child just isn't getting us organized, and you just can't. And let's say it isn't a neurological diagnosis or whatever.
They need more support
Mhm,
if they're sometimes it's surprising sometimes what and you might look at other kids, other 10-year-olds, and you're thinking to yourself, they're way more organized and
mhm,
it's a benefit to them. Again, this is if you have a child that is really struggling with their organization, you go back and back and back until they don't need help anymore. We just got tutoring for one of my granddaughters was really struggling in math, and I said, but there needs to be some intervention here because it's starting in conversation. She's in third grade now, is really starting to affect her self-esteem. She's in
mm,
traditional school. The tutor, and I've tutored in both math and science. When you tutor, you go back until there's no problems, and then you
mm,
work forward.
mhm,
You're going to go back until you're going to treat these just as you would any academic school. You go
mhm,
back until they can stay organized. And if that means that the two of you need to do everything side by side as you scaffold that, there's a hole there. There's something missing. They just don't have that. And if you
mhm,
think it's important enough to teach, it to take the time. So think of time. Time is the money of life. If you think something's important enough to take some of your child and your life's money for some of your time for, then it's important enough to go all the way back until it's not frustrating to work on.
mhm,
And if you do that, expect there to be leaps and bounds
mhm.
forward. I went over the tutor's been working with my granddaughter for about 3 weeks, and I was over there and she was showing me what she was doing in math, and she sat down next to me to do the work the tutor had assigned, and she flew through it.
Yeah.
Now she's not at grade level in math, but
Mhm,
she's flying through. And
mhm,
so what they're doing is they're trying to figure out where there was holes
mhm.
in her understanding.
I imagine a lot of parents are feeling pressed for time, and
Mhm.
um, all of this, as you mentioned, takes
It
time and
does.
energy. So, but I mean, I guess there's really no shortcuts except for outsourcing. I mean, there are
Th
people who
there
do
are shortcuts,
specialize
actually.
in.
There are shortcuts.
Yeah.
Look for
Mhm,
curriculum that, weaves in these skills. Meta-cognition. In my science courses, I like to ask questions in it, and I'll sometimes see online people say, "My child and I, we don't like it when someone asks a question that they already know." It's actually, if you wanna work on metacognition, look for resources that ask questions, that'll ask a question and then go on to build into to use what you already know into a bigger topic. That's the that's actually curriculum doing the metacognitive work for you. And so don't think to yourself, "Oh, show what you know," or, those little out boxes
mhm,
that'll ask a question. Don't skip those if you want to work on metacognition. So that you can, I mean, actually, if you're working on something like organization and you child has to start organizing for their science supplies, that's actually might take a little bit of time. It's one of those things that the time on the front end means
mhm,
for the rest of the time you're ever teaching them science or any class that needs that sort of organization, you don't have to do it anymore. And if you have multiple children and one of them learns the organization, you're work on it with the older ones, you can have them help scaffold with the youngers. And then, um, yeah, and that's the other thing. Well, that's why I say work on 2 or 3 of these. It's not so look for curriculum that it's easy to build some of these in. Choose, if you have, you've got a child that needs to work on kinesthetics, choose a math program, and they're good in math.
mhm,
Choose a math program that's got a kinesthetic component.
mhm,
And okay, so let's take the kinesthetic. My granddaughter who's struggling, they really do there's a very strong emphasis on memorization. Well, what do you think one of the first things I did when I sat down? I sat down and evaluated whether she was a kinesthetic learner, because a lot of kids who are kinesthetic learners struggle with these programs that
Mm.
are that they just want those math facts memorized. And that's fine, except now she's being asked to apply that into concepts. And sure, you memorize the multiplication facts, but that doesn't mean that child's she was working on 4 times 7 equals 28. 4 times 7 equals 5 times 4 plus 2 times 4. Well, my granddaughter was looking at that, had absolutely no. She was felt, she's like, but the kids in my class already know how to do that. So I got out I said, let's work on this concept with $5 bills. So we went to the bank and got a bunch of
Mm.
$5 bills. She needed to see it. She needed to touch it
Mhm.
to learn that concept. And so does it take more time as I'm working with her right now on some of this conceptual math that she's getting in class? Sure. But it means that then she'll be able to do her math. It also means that her self-esteem is not, it's really having a big effect on her self-esteem to
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
the only one of her friends that doesn't get this.
Mm. All right. We've covered everything I was looking to cover. So thank you. And so for parents or educators who want to dive into this further, you did mention the book um, with
Smart but
Scatty,
scattered. I'm actually working
Smart
on
Scatty.
I am working on a book. I'm working on a
Oh,
book right now. It is about a hand grafting in education. This is one of the central parts of it.
hmm,
It should be out in early next year.
okay.
No, should be out in the middle of next year. Sorry.
Okay.
And this but in the meantime, if you have any questions about this, I've got numerous talks that are available through the chomeschoolers.com website. And I have you can always reach out to me with specific questions. Blair at chomeschoolers.com.
And I realized we didn't mention what C stands for. So just real quick.
Secular, eclectic, academic homeschoolers.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.